All right, last week we started chapter 27 and got about halfway through our study on undesigned coincidences. Apparently at some point when I was typing up my notes, I typed in consequences and then read it as consequences, and then I guess I kept referring to it as undesigned consequences. I apologize for that. It's supposed to be undesigned coincidences, which is what the chapter's all about, in the fact that and again, this is from a textual academic perspective. Obviously, they are designed from the perspective of God's inspiration, but from the perspective of looking at it as textual evidence and so forth, these are coincidences that help provide commentary for how the Bible basically provides its own commentary for things that are recorded. And Doy focuses on the Gospels. We looked at the first couple last week. We noticed Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 5, and how that James and John, how they were called to be apostles. Jesus says, "I'll make you fishers of men." They drop everything and they leave and they go with Jesus. Luke tells us the kind of little bit more backstory into why they were mending their nets, why they were willing to follow Jesus so quickly. We also looked at Matthew chapter 9 and discussed the house of Matthew, or the house of Levi, Matthew the tax collector, how that in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus is in the house, and Mark tells us that it was Matthew's house or Levi's house. Luke tells us that the reason why they were there was because of the reception that Matthew was holding for Jesus. And then in Matthew chapter 26, we find that as the Roman soldiers are spitting on Jesus, they're beating him, they're telling him, "Prophesy as to who hit you." But Matthew doesn't specifically record that Jesus was blindfolded. Luke, however, tells us that he was blindfolded. Thus, it makes sense now as to what the mockery was all about. So that's about as far as we got last week. So this week, we're going to finish up chapter 27 and possibly get into chapter 28, hopefully. So as he's going through these different coincidences, and this is not necessarily a comprehensive list, and certainly doesn't even take into account the epistles and the book of Acts and so forth, but there certainly is a whole lot more even in the Gospels themselves. In Matthew chapter 8 and in verse 14, we have how that the oppressed and sick were being brought to Jesus in the evening. We see this in Matthew 8, starting in verse 14. Matthew 8, starting in verse 14, when Jesus had come to Peter's house, I'm sorry, did I get that wrong here? No, starting in verse 14 here. Yeah, when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, the fever left her, she arose and served them. And then verse 16, when evening had come, they brought to him many who were non-possessed, or demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, "He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses." And Doy points out that verse 16 says, when evening had come, they brought to him many. Well, why did they wait until the evening? And that's the point that he makes from Mark chapter 1. He explains that during the day, that was the Sabbath. And so presumably they waited till 6 p.m. when technically the next day started for under the Jewish reckoning of time. The evening started at 6 p.m., and so for the next day, then they brought so that Jesus wouldn't have to do it on the Sabbath. Of course, would there have been anything wrong with Jesus doing it on the Sabbath? Jesus actually deliberately did some miracles on the Sabbath to make the point that he was Lord of the Sabbath. But they waited until evening to do that for that purpose, or so it would seem anyway, from Mark chapter 1. Thoughts or comments through that one? Luke chapter 9, we see Jesus had charged Peter, James, and John regarding the Mount of Transfiguration, not to tell anyone what they had seen. And what's interesting about that is the fact that we find that when all of this happened on the Mount of Transfiguration, according to Luke chapter 9, they didn't tell anyone. And it's Mark tells us the command, Luke tells us they obeyed the command. So when Luke tells us that they didn't tell anybody about what they had seen, well, why wouldn't they tell people? Mark explains that Jesus had told them, don't tell anyone about what you saw. And so that's why they didn't say anything at that time. Of course, later on, they certainly would. Peter would even reference it in 1 Peter. In Mark chapter 6, verse 31, 2 Peter chapter 1. I think it's when Peter mentioned that. Mark chapter 6, verses 31 through 44. We see, this is one of the accounts of Jesus feeding the 5,000, but there was a great number of multitudes in and around the region. And in fact, as Jesus is going different places, whole groups of people are following him. And it seems as though there's an inordinate amount of people that, according to John chapter 6 and verse 4, one of the reasons why there were so many people is because it was Passover. And so a whole lot of people had come to Jerusalem for Passover, as they did. And as a result, many of them heard from their friends about Jesus, were kind of drawn by the people telling them about what this man Jesus of Nazareth was saying. And so this whole groups of people were gathering and listening to Jesus. And of course, the feeding of the 5,000 took place then. In Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 2, Matthew records what Herod tells his servants. This is Matthew 14, starting in verse 1, as he had already killed John the Baptist. Remember, in fact, Matthew records what happened regarding his wife's daughter and so forth, and what all he promised. So starting in verse 1, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him." And of course, verse 3, he describes the fact that he put John the Baptist to death. And I should say it was Herodias, which he took as his wife, but he had no right to take as his wife, which is part of the reason how John ended up being beheaded, is that Herodias was mad about that. So then you combine that or link that to other passages like Luke chapter 8. Luke 8, and starting in verse 3, we see, starting in verse 3, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, who was Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for him from their substance. And this is talking about those individuals who were with him, talking about the 12, verse 1, certain women who'd been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. And Joanna, the wife of Chuza, is listed here as being with Jesus. Now, again, another possibility, or I would even say likelihood, is that I believe that Matthew was inspired of the Holy Spirit. And so it would not have mattered that there was somebody in the household of Herod who was informing the saints about what was being said. However, again, from a textual perspective, an academic perspective, one of the ways in which this can certainly be supported is by recognizing that there was a person in Herod's house who was aware of what Herod was saying, because Chuza was Herod's steward. He was a manager of his house. And if Herod's going around saying this Jesus of Nazareth, or the stories about Jesus of Nazareth, this is actually John the Baptist who's risen, then that's going to get reported back to the disciples. Either way, obviously, it still holds true that Matthew's inspired of the Holy Spirit. But regardless of how that information came to Matthew, it also came to Luke as well. But it shows this connection, and it shows this. I guess certainly you could certainly see how this woman Joanna would certainly be able to tell the saints, Herod thinks it's John the Baptist who's risen, and is after him or something. Thoughts or comments through that? And it could be a combination of the two. Yeah, it certainly could be a combination of the two for sure. Yeah. All right. And then the next one is coming from John chapter 13. Nope, I skipped one. Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 58. We have in Mark 14 and Mark 15, we have the accusations against Jesus after the Jews had taken him by lawless hands. and it's being accused of Jesus that he has said that he would destroy and rebuild the temple in 3 days. Okay. However, according to John, John gives us the statement of Jesus. He does not record this as an accusation when Jesus was on trial. Mark gives the accusations, but not the original statement of Jesus found in John. And so John records Jesus actually making the statement in the actual account of when Jesus said it, that Jesus was referring to his body. If you destroy this temple, and you could almost imagine Jesus pointing to himself there, and he says, I will rebuild it in 3 days, speaking to his resurrection. He wasn't speaking about the physical temple in Jerusalem. However, whether unintentionally or deliberately by the Jews, they took that and they made an accusation out of it to say that this man has threatened to destroy the temple, and he claims he'll be able to rebuild it in 3 days. And so that's part of the accusations. And so between Mark and John, we know that what they're saying isn't untrue in the fact that Jesus did say that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But he wasn't referring to the physical temple, he's referring to his body. And so, again, one of those great instances where Scripture provides commentary on itself, in the occasion here of Mark and John. Thoughts on that? And I think that's a great point that Doy makes here, is that this isn't what copying looks like. If John had copied from Mark, John would have recorded what Mark recorded, in that these are the accusations that they laid against Jesus, or some of them. And yet, John doesn't even record those accusations. He simply records the event in which Jesus said it that Mark doesn't talk about. That's not copying. And you don't happen upon that by mistake. Okay, this is when Jesus said it, this is what he's referring to, and Mark says they took those accusations and ran with them. Again, I tend to think it was probably deliberate, but maybe they really thought Jesus was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Anything else through that? John chapter 13. We find in John chapter 13 the account of Jesus washing the apostles' feet. And this is one of those very commonly referenced. It's an account that we know well about Jesus. He gets down on his hands and knees. He's going to wash the feet of the apostles. Peter says, no, you're not washing my feet. I should be washing your feet. Jesus says, if you don't let me wash your feet, you have no part of me. And Peter says, well, don't wash my feet. Wash all of me. Okay, if that's what that means. So we have, and it's a wonderful account, and it shows us how we are to, in fact, Jesus himself provides the application that if I, your master, am willing to serve you, you should be willing to serve one another in the same way. All right. However, Luke chapter 22 helps provide even a deeper context for this event. Because in Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 24, Luke 22, starting in verse 24, we have kind of the background of what's happening. Now, there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. And so Jesus goes on to describe the importance of being willing to serve one another. And in the context of John 13, why did I switch over here? John 13, when we see Jesus washing the apostles' feet, this is before his hour comes, starting in verse 1, after supper. Well, what had happened before in Luke 22 and starting in verse 31, we see how that Jesus warns Peter about needing to be strong. We see in verse 34, Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times. And then as we go on down, we have the prayer in the garden and so forth. So this is all happening on the same day that we're describing the washing of the feet. And this is why Doyle brings both of these up, is because this is all happening on that Thursday before Jesus is betrayed. And so when we consider then what happens in John chapter 13, the washing of the feet, it helps us to provide, it provides us even deeper appreciation of why Jesus did this. It's because the apostles are arguing over who was the greatest. And Jesus says, he who is greatest should become least. Thus, if I am your master, who is the greatest, am willing to serve you, then so you should serve one another. And it just provides an additional benefit for us to be able to see how those two instances and the kind of the reason why Jesus did that, in addition to showing that they should be servants, it was to put at rest this dispute that was going on between them about who was greatest. Jesus says, well, you shouldn't be discussing who's greatest, because ultimately your actions speak louder than words, and he who is greatest is the one who should seek to serve, just as I am here to serve. Thoughts or comments through that? In fact, to me, that was one of the, out of all, and of course all of these provide a little bit of commentary on each other, but this one in particular I thought was really interesting to show that background, that it wasn't just something that came out of the blue, that Jesus wanted to make the point about being a servant to one another. There was a reason why he did that. All right. Then there's, let's see, we've got three more, I think. We have Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 2 on through verse 4. Luke shows the accusation of the Jews and the response of Pilate. It shows Pilate's absolving of Jesus, and there's no explanation. In fact, it's really abrupt. In Luke chapter 23, so we see the whole multitude of them, verse 1, arose and led him to Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king. Verse 3, then Pilate asked him, saying, are you king of the Jews? And he answered and said to him, it is as you say. And then all of a sudden, verse 4, Pilate said to the chief priests of the crowd, I find no fault in this man. If anything, just based on what we're reading here, verse 3 would seem to be an affirmation of the accusations, or at least the accusation saying that he's a king, of what the crowd was saying, that this is problematic, given that Caesar's our king. And so Pilate certainly shouldn't, based on just this, shouldn't have simply turned to the crowd and say, I find no fault in it. But what we have in addition to this is the fact that in John chapter 18, starting in verse 33, we have the fuller dialogue. In fact, verse 3 and 4, or rather verse 3, doesn't even take place in front of the crowd, apparently. Because in John 18, starting in verse 33, I know this makes people sick, I'm sorry. Starting in verse Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? So it's not like all of this is happening all in one moment in front of the entire leaders of the Jews and the multitude and so forth. This is happening on its own, separately, apparently between Jesus and Pilate, whether there were guards there or not. We don't know, but Jesus and Pilate specifically are the two having dialogue here. So in verse 34, Jesus answered him, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? And Pilate answered and said, am I a Jew? Your own nation, your chief and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? And of course, Pilate knows of the accusations. Jesus answered, verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? This is one of the accusations. They say that you claim to be a king. And again, that's problematic if Caesar's supposed to be king and yet you claim to be king of the Jews. Jesus answered and says, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born. For this cause I've come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate said to him, what is truth? Almost as again, I've always taken this as almost a kind of introspective type of, almost to himself, what is truth, kind of contrasting his upbringing of the Roman gods versus the one God and Jesus claiming to be from heaven. And then in verse 38, when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. If you just read Luke's account and you don't necessarily have a little bit of that background, you might think it's rather abrupt. But Luke, of course, Luke has a lot he needs to record and a lot he wants to talk about, so he skips over that dialogue that John records for us because the people that Luke's writing to, they're already going to know that this is what happened. They're going to know that this is the dialogue that took place. And so Luke skips on through that to get into the crucifixion and so forth. But what we have by John is a kind of a more in-depth detail to explain what Luke tells us. Thoughts or comments on that?
We deal with what is truth today. You know, what's true for you isn't true for me. And I mean, it's an age-old question. It's not new.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We deal with it all the time.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, is there the lack of objective truth in our society? There's your truth, there's my truth, there's lived experiences. That lived experience is true for them, that may not be true for you. It's a matter of perspective. Okay, a lot of times people take the whole beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I've heard it used, truth is in the eye of the beholder. And from an individual perspective on views and opinions, sure. If that's how you're defining truth, which is how our society defines it, it's your perspective, it's your reality, it's your truth. But is there objective truth? Is there a reality behind people's perceptions, behind people's interpretations? Is there a real truth? Yeah, there is. And that's what's so great about the gospel, is that the gospel doesn't give us just individual opinion or individual thoughts or interpretations. It's fact. This is what happened. If this happened, therefore, this is what we should do. Any thoughts through that?
It's like when anyone speaks, we can take a snippet of the sentences you just said and come out with a completely false doctrine that Michael disagrees.
Absolutely.
We have to take everything you just said to piece it all together. It's the same thing with these situations. This one in particular, because there's a conversation that takes place.
Yeah.
You know, if you just take the one passage, you can come away with one understanding. But when you look at the entirety, just like the passages on faith or baptism, you have to look at the totality of them to get the full picture.
Right. And that's called, what term do we use for that? Context. Context is something that is sorely lacking in our society, and that's probably always been the case, but it seems so much more so now, whether it's in the reporting on news articles or whatever. Context is severely lacking and severely underappreciated in our society, and particularly in our religious community, for sure. All right, anything else through that?
Throughout the scriptures, Jesus answers that. He says, I am.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's not just his perspective or his truth is that he is the truth. It's the truth. Absolutely. Yeah. All right, so earlier here in the Gospel of John, John chapter 18 and starting in verse 10, we have a situation, there's several records of this, but Simon Peter, when they come to arrest Jesus, Simon Peter takes one of the swords that they had. He drew it and he struck the high priest's servant's ear. He cut off his right ear, and the high priest's servant's name was Malchus. Okay, we know that from another account. He cut off his right, or here in verse 10, it says the servant's name was Malchus. There's another account that has that absent, Malchus's name, but they knew who it was. But do you think Peter was actually swinging for his ear? I think that's what his aim was? What vocation did Peter have? He was a fisherman. He wasn't a well-trained individual with a sword. Okay, but Peter had said, "I'm willing to die for you." And when these soldiers come in this moment, Okay, give Peter the credit at least to think that I'm willing to fight for you, Jesus. Okay, a lot of times we skip directly to his denying him 3 times, which he did. But at least in this moment, he was willing to die for Jesus. Because I don't know what he thought was going to happen, because it wasn't just Malchus who was there. There were other people, soldiers armed, who were trained. Peter wasn't going to win that, and neither were any of the apostles if they were going to fight. But Peter, however, and we're not told anyone else took a sword or anything like that, but Peter, being Peter, of course, he did. But then, in verse 11, Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup of which my Father has given me?" And then it moves on. Okay, so we read about Malchus. We read about his ear being cut off. Jesus says, "Stop, put your sword up." And then everybody just kind of continues. And Doy brings out some really good questions here. He says, and then, of course, in verse 36, Jesus tells Pilate, "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, but it is not of this world, therefore my servants don't fight." But Peter took a sword and cut off Malchus's ear. So Doy brings up a couple points. He says, doesn't Peter cutting off Malchus's ear with the sword constitute fighting? Why wasn't Peter arrested for this? You'd think Peter would have been arrested for cutting off Malchus's ear. That's kind of a serious thing. John doesn't explain that, does he? Okay, so the situation we're told in Luke chapter 22, in this case, where it's kind of interesting how in the previous instance, Luke goes into more detail about the conversation, or Luke doesn't go into detail about the conversation between Pilate and Jesus, but John does. In this case, John kind of goes through, doesn't talk about the specifics of what happened in the garden, but Luke does. In Luke chapter 22, I'm going to scroll really quick through here, going all the way down to verse 51, verse 50. So, starting in verse 49, when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, "Lord, shall we strike with a sword?" One of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. So we don't see the name of Malchus. We're not told who did it, although John tells us who did it and what the name of the servant of the high priest was. Verse 51, "But Jesus answered and said, Permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him." How exactly did he do that? I don't know. Did he pick the ear up off the ground, put it on his head, and it just he reattached it? I don't know. I don't know how he did that or what it looked like. But Jesus healed the ear of Malchus. Then in verse 52, Jesus addresses the multitude who has come out to arrest him, and then having arrested him, verse 54, they bring him to the high priest's house. And as Doy points out in our book, he says there's no evidence of the attempt to fight, and what would Peter have been arrested for? I mean, there's no evidence of a fight. The ear has been healed. So now, what do you arrest him for? And I thought this was an excellent point, if the witnesses tried to explain what happened, they would have had to admit what Jesus did, that he healed his ear. He healed his ear. Jesus' actions in healing and in forbidding further use of the sword shows his claim to be true. There would be no fighting. And I thought that was a great point, that between these two examples, we have the great lesson, first of all, from Jesus, that Jesus doesn't want his servants to fight. Peter, of course, Peter didn't do that on the commandment of the Lord, but Peter did what he did. Jesus stopped it, healed the ear, and then said, "All right, if you're going to take me, let's go." And after that is when the apostles, the disciples dispersed in fear. We're not going to fight. Jesus is going to let himself be taken. And keep in mind, they're all used to Jesus as kind of disappearing or somehow making his way out of the attempt to be arrested. This is the first time Jesus has actually been arrested, despite how many other attempts at arresting him. So this is new. This is different. Jesus has allowed himself to be arrested. And of course, you combine that with all the statements from Jesus that I have to die and that it's happening. It's going to be happening soon. The giving of the institution of the Lord's Supper. I will not drink this again until I'm with you in my Father's kingdom. all of that together, the disciples, they scatter. They're afraid about what's happening. Any thoughts through that?
Jesus
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
so, it goes back to the
Well, and that goes to show why Pilate then absolved Jesus. I find no fault in it, because Jesus provided the context of why he claimed to be the king, or a king, which is the king. Because this wasn't about a physical kingdom or physical kingship or physical authority over Caesar or anything else. It was about a heavenly kingship, which then, for me at least, provides very interesting thought process that where in place of what the accusations are on the plaque that is placed at the foot of the cross, when Jesus is hung, Pilate wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And remember, the Jews were upset about that. They said, no, you're supposed to be putting the accusation. He claimed to be King of the Jews, which is why he's up there. But what did Pilate respond? What I have written. Which to me, it just kind of sends shivers up my spine. Pilate, certainly had his faults in this, and there's certainly, a case to be made that he certainly was a part of it, because he basically gave them liberty to do this to Jesus. But when you combine what Pilate wrote, Pilate's dialogue with Jesus, and then what was happening in the background with Pilate's wife? Sorry? She said, have nothing to do with this man. And why did she say that? Because of dreams. She was receiving disturbing dreams. What the content of those dreams were, we don't know. But she was receiving disturbing dreams that convinced her have nothing to do with this fella. And so between all of that, I'm convinced that Pilate, to some degree, believed that Jesus at least might be what he claimed to be. Now, obviously, it wasn't such a faith or belief that, first of all, prevented Pilate from allowing the Jews to crucify him, and there's no evidence that Pilate ever became a Christian, but there seemed to have been a little bit of convincing there that this man is certainly not worthy of death, and he is not a threat either to the Jews or to Caesar. He was convinced of that. But again, because of the political situation, the Jews were going to riot if he didn't at least let them do it. And certainly Caesar, that was one of the reasons why Pilate was put in place to start with, was to stop the rioting in Judea. And so Pilate let them do it. I saw a hand somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
This was also a sign.
As a lamb to the slaughter.
He did not verbally defend himself.
Yep.
He did not fight back. And so his demeanor, to use your word from last week, his demeanor was such of, I would think, of confidence, of, I've got this, they're going to do it, I'm expecting it. And so there wasn't any yelling or screaming or I'm innocent or anything.
What's interesting is during the trial in front of the Jews, and well, in fact, Jesus, actually, when you go through and read of that Thursday night and into Friday, when Jesus is being tried, he's tried like 4 or 5 times. He appears before the high priest according to the Romans. Then he goes to the high priest according to the law. Remember, they had 2 high priests. One was Roman appointed. One was high priest by the law. He was sent before Pilate. He was sent before Herod. Then he was sent back to Pilate. So, 5 times over the course of that night, Jesus was examined, okay, or tried. So in all of that, what's interesting is that when Jesus was before the Jews, remember they had witnesses who kept testifying, and they were false witnessing against him, but they were contradicting each other in what they were saying. And at a certain point, Jesus, it's almost as if Jesus is like, they can't even do this right, okay? And he has to kind of help the process along, and to that he actually admits or acknowledges who he is, or he claimed to be, which kind of then led the Jews to finally saying blasphemy, and then everything started going. But in the initial point, they couldn't even get their act together to false witness against the guy. And Jesus kind of had to, instead of defending himself, he actually kind of had to help the process along because this is going nowhere. And so,
And it wasn't that he claimed this.
right, yeah,
They claimed it wasn't.
right,
But he stated, I am.
right. And they put it, and they went through all this because of his claims. Absolutely. All right. Anything else through that? All right. The last one that Doy brings up is a combination of it's a combination of Matthew, John, and Luke. Mark isn't in this, but we have Matthew, John, Luke, and then John chapter 12 as well. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus, he says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Well, what miracles is he talking about that were done in Chorazin and Bethsaida? Matthew doesn't go through that. Matthew doesn't record miracles that were done in Chorazin or Bethsaida. John, though, in John chapter 6 and in verse 5, he references Philip, and he talks about the fact that he sees this large crowd coming to him. He says to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?" Why is Philip specifically mentioned here? Why does Jesus ask Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?" Well, you combine this with Luke chapter 9, verses 10 and 11, we find that they go to Bethsaida. When the apostles returned, they gave an account to him of all that they had done. Taking them with him, he withdrew by himself to a city called Bethsaida, which is the event of John 6. John 12, and in verse 21, tells us that Philip was from Bethsaida, which is why Jesus then turned to Philip and asked, "Where can we go to buy bread so that this group may eat?" Because Philip was from Bethsaida, which means that the miracle that Jesus did in feeding the 5,000 took place where? Bethsaida. Or at least one of the occasions. There's several different accounts or records of Jesus feeding multitudes, at least possibly 2 different occasions. And this is one of those, that they were in Bethsaida when this took place. Now, specifically, what miracle was done in Chorazin, we don't have a record of it being specified what was done in Chorazin. However, of all the miracles that are recorded, some of them may have been done in Chorazin, and it just doesn't say, and they were in Chorazin. But in this particular instance, we know that when Jesus says that he performed miracles in Chorazin and Bethsaida, he wasn't making stuff up. He really had done, and it's even recorded about the miracle in Bethsaida of feeding the 5,000. And he says, if these miracles had happened in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago. And yet, what's the point? What's wrong with Chorazin and Bethsaida? They're not paying attention. They're not listening. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
Well, even if we didn't have this account of one being done in Bethsaida, we do have John's statement in John 20 that many other signs truly of Jesus which are not written.
Absolutely.
The amount of miracles and signs that he did, we don't even know the
Yeah,
amount of.
absolutely.
So, this does provide additional proof, which is helpful.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
even if that wasn't there, we still have other statements to verify that Jesus did so many miracles other places and things.
Yeah. The fact that Chorazin isn't specifically recorded is of no relevance, because John specifically says there was a whole lot of other stuff that happened that isn't recorded. In fact, if it had been recorded of everything that Jesus did over the course of his 3 or so years preaching and teaching, what does John say would have happened? The world would be full of the books that would be written. Okay, and it's whether he's being literal or figurative, the idea is that there would be so much. You can't write it all down in one record. In this case, John's referring to his record, the Gospel of John. You can't write it all down of everything that Jesus did, which also speaks to just how busy Jesus was, how constant Jesus was about the work of the Father. I saw a hand somewhere. Yes, sir.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, there's no way we know, and the apostles may not have been because if you think about the woman who touched the hem of his garment,
Oh, yeah.
if Jesus hadn't said what faith he had, he would have healed her and nobody would have known but her.
That's right.
You know, so there's no telling.
That's true. Well, and there were occasions where Jesus was on his own. There were occasions where he sent the apostles away, the point where Jesus was there, the apostles were in the boat and Jesus is walking on the water. If, of course, Jesus did it for the purpose of showing the power of himself to the apostles. But if the apostles hadn't come up out of the boat, hadn't been looking, they wouldn't have known Jesus was walking on the water. I mean, there's a lot of times where Jesus was, for periods of time, by himself in certain areas or certain places for a period of time without the apostles there. There may have been a ton of miracles he did without them realizing it or being there to see it specifically. So that's a good point. Yeah. Anything else?
But we have sufficient written down to convince us.
Absolutely. But these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God, and believing you may have life in his name. All right, the conclusion that Doy brings up here at the end, the cumulative force of this is that one undesigned coincidence might be seen purely as accidental. By chance, two pieces of a puzzle happen to fit. But once we start discovering numerous examples of crisscrossing the documents, it becomes ridiculous to insist that they are all just accidental. It is important to see that though each gospel is independent, they also fit together in a remarkable way and can indeed help to verify each other. In other words, we can use one book of the Bible to help verify another book of the Bible. Just looking into the gospels themselves, apart from other evidences, can give us confidence in their truthfulness. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the previous chapter about using the Bible to defend the Bible, in that these are all separate accounts recording the exact same events with some details in one that may not be in another, and vice versa. And it's just a great example of that actually in application, of that in action. And this is just between the Gospels. This is not including Old Testament being quoted by New Testament writers. This is not including the epistles or the book of Acts or anything else. And so it certainly does provide us the confidence in that. Any thoughts through that point? The objection that we cannot use the Bible to prove the Bible is built upon fallacious assumptions about the nature and composition of the Bible period, since the Bible is comprised of many books written by several different authors and not compiled until later. Since their central claims are historical in nature, since they were in a position to know what they were talking about, and since the authors agree on the central claims, then there is no reason why these first century texts cannot be used to provide testimony to help verify each other. Such is the way we would use any other ancient sources, whether compiled into one book later or not. Undesigned coincidences provide excellent examples of the way these Gospels fit together, demonstrating that they weren't just merely copying. They were independent, yet they still provide information helping to verify and explain one another. And remember, that was kind of the basis of the introduction that Doy kind of went into, is the claim by skeptics that these Gospels just kind of all borrowed from a single or maybe two main sources. They just copied each other. There's enough individual information that is separate that doesn't make any sense. Okay. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up with the questions for chapter 27, and then we will get into chapter 28 next week. And chapter 28 is the gospel as its own apologetic. That will be the last chapter. There are 3 appendices at the end of the book that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on, but we will go through those very briefly, and then we'll be moving on to something else. So be thinking about what that's going to be, and we'll move on next week. Thank you, everybody.